Hello, it's great to be with you today. At Ideas at Ford, I am Darren Walker. I am a brown skinned African American man with a bald head, lucite frame glasses. I'm wearing a blue shirt, a gray sweater, and I'm sitting in my office here at the Ford Foundation with artifacts of my travels and work behind me. I'm delighted to welcome my friend, Dr. Jillian Tett, and her new book, Anthrovision, which uh, is a radical book in many ways because she is challenging some of our uh, prevailing thoughts and ideas about the power of technology alone to solve our problems. So, Jillian, please join me and introduce yourself so that we can start our conversation.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm Gillian Tett. I'm she or her. I'm a white, blonde-haired, middle-aged woman who tries to downplay my wrinkles. I am currently sitting in London because I'm on my way back from the COP26 event in Glasgow. But I actually normally live in New York, where I've been for the best part of a decade working as a journalist with the Financial Times, but also as a writer, drawing on my background as an anthropologist. And I'm thrilled to be with you, Darren, talking about my book and about my background. And I say you showed people the version of the American version of the book, which has got a bright red jacket and a picture. If you open up the back flap cover of me, which is a picture of me
There's you, there you are.
looking with a bright red top, looking quite sort of assertive and confident, or being, as I sometimes joke, like a fox babe. And the British version of the book, which I'm holding here, is nice and subtle and understated. And the picture that they chose for me, because the British publishers vetoed that red picture, is a picture of me looking slightly ditzy and vague. That tells you everything you
I
need to know about
see
why culture
that.
matters.
Goodness. Well, that photograph, Jillian, uh, is subdued. I'll just say that. As
Well,
is
I'm
that
sitting in
cover.
British culture is understated. So,
There you have it. Well, Jillian, this book is not understated. This book actually seeks to disrupt some of our thinking. Now, I have come to know AI as artificial intelligence. You talk in this book about a different idea of anthropology intelligence. Uh, for those of us who maybe took that one 3 hour course of anthropology as undergraduates and know nothing more than that, other than the sort of things we pick up from quotes by Margaret Mead and the like. Um, Anthropology is a really interesting discipline, and it has a rich and long history filled with all kinds of colorful people. And so I'm keen for you to just put into context anthropology and how you came to this idea of anthropology intelligence.
well, a lot of people outside anthropology think that what the discipline is basically like Indiana Jones for academics. It's kind of an excuse to go off and have exotic, weird experiences, looking at rituals and colorful things, and to make documentaries, Discovery Channel documentaries, or get stuff from museums. And it's kind of not surprising people think about that, because if you go back 150 years, that's kind of what anthropologists were doing, with a framing that was often pretty unfortunate and which many modern anthropologists would reject, which was it was used to be a pretty sort of imperialist, sexist, racist kind of discipline, where essentially Victorian imperialists or early American leaders would go and look at what they regarded as the natives or the savages or primitives or whatever ghastly word they used, to try and peer at them and try and look at the essence of humankind. But in the 20th century, anthropology did a complete U-turn. It went from being a basic tool of imperialism to actually being a discipline which championed the idea that all human beings are valuable. No one has the right to either divide other human beings into races or boxes with clear-cut boundaries. You know, human diversity is a spectrum. You can't rank them hierarchically. And anthropology really became devoted to trying to champion this concept of it pays to immerse yourself in other perspectives and other viewpoints, not just so that you can understand how other people live and think and why it might be different from you, which we need to do in a globalized world, but also because jumping out of your own world enables you to look back at yourself. I mean, there's this wonderful phrase the Chinese have, which is a fish can't see water. Nobody can see their cultural assumptions unless they jump out of them and actually expose themselves to other people. So anthropologists today are actually working as much in the Western world as in the non-Western world, and trying to bring this principle of, you know, the idea of studying other people teaches ourselves about something about them and us at the same time. And I think that's a very, very valuable thing to actually be upholding right now. And it's doubly valuable, not just because we are so globalized and yet also so polarized, but also because, you know, machines, robots, computers are taking over our lives. I mean, the pandemic has pushed us all into cyberspace. And that's dangerous for many reasons if we don't think about it, because although digital connections are amazing, you know, when we go online in cyberspace, we don't leave our tribal behaviors behind, we actually intensify them. But also we have this illusion that the robots and machines can solve problems, you know, better than us often. And that's just not true. You know, actually, if we're going to use technology effectively, we have to understand the human context in which it was created and coded, and the human context in which it's actually implemented, and how it's changing human culture in a way that affects us all. So that's why I say that, you know, a world of AI needs a second AI, anthropology intelligence.
Well, that's a very provocative thought, but that would require the training, the education, the culturalization of the sciences to be completely opened up. I mean, most computer science programs do not require the beyond a minimum of humanities, of social science. And you're probably not going to find a lot of um, deans and professors who were trained in the normal engineering sciences to say, oh, we need to change from our requirements of electrical engineering. Yeah, shed off 6 of those hours so that someone can go like Gillian Tett did and study marriage rituals in one of the stands. I mean, how do you think about disrupting the educational system? Because that's what it would require. The things that you identify in this book, and the attitudes and the behaviors of the men. We're talking primarily of men, the engineers, coders, the technologists. They were all trained, and many of them were trained at the same schools, the MITs and Stanfords of the world.
Well, if you ever needed a reason as to why the tech sector needs to wake up and actually look more widely at what it's doing, it really has been this explosive techlash. And the fact that, you know, groups like Facebook and others are now facing this kind of public backlash, precisely because they don't have this wider anthropological vision or a sense of context. But just let's dial back for a second, because, you know, one of the things I'm arguing is that in the late 20th century, you know, we as a society developed a bunch of intellectual tools to navigate the world with, which were really effective to a certain degree. So we developed economic models, we developed corporate balance sheets, we developed big data sets. And all of those are really useful, except they all suffer by the same flaw. They're bounded. They're defined by what you put in, and the stuff you leave out, the context, is often just ignored. And that doesn't matter if the context is stable, but if the context is changing, having that kind of tunnel vision can really damage you. It's
I
a bit
love
like,
this. You say tunnel vision versus lateral vision.
Absolutely. It's a bit like someone walking through a dark wood at night with a compass. You know, your compass can be brilliant technologically and you don't want to throw it away. That can be your big data set, it can be your algorithms, your economic model, your balance sheet. But if you walk through that dark wood at night and just look down at that compass all the time and just look at the dial, you're probably going to walk into a tree. You know, we have to look up and look around and set what we're doing in context. And one of the things that went so badly wrong with the tech sector in recent years is that there was this incredible sense of tunnel vision, just like there was in the financial sector in Wall Street in the run up to 2008. So, one of the things I'm calling for is for all these Silicon Valley titans to look at what they're doing with a wider sense of context, and understand the implications of the tech they're creating. And then also think about the social context in which tech is being created. Who's actually writing the code? Who's controlling those AI programs? Who's defining it? And what are the pitfalls of having tunnel vision? And it's really problematic that in education today, we tend to put people into different boxes. It's even worse in the UK than the US. You know, there's a desperate need for people who can blend social and computing science. And my last point is, you know, it isn't just about tech. I mean, one thing we've learned from COVID is that, you know, we needed to actually blend medical, computer, and social science to fight a pandemic. You can't beat a pandemic just with medical science or just with big data sets. You know, if you can't persuade people to take the vaccine, then it's not going to work. Culture matters. So
Well, you
bringing
talk about this. You talk about this quite compellingly. The example of Ebola, and you write about the complexity there, and also the missed signals and the cultural assumptions about what's normal and what's not normal. And so talk about that. And obviously Paul Farmer and others who are part of this book had a role to play. But that was a seminal moment in really, I think, for you defining this missing link of the kind of AI that was not present there.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the Ebola story is something which most Americans knew almost nothing about, still know very little about. And there's a presumption, you know, I think until quite, you know, many people that actually that's a kind of weird thing that happens in a weird exotic place we don't really know about and don't really care about. But it's an incredible story that should have been a massive wake up call in relation to COVID and given really important clues about how to tackle COVID. And essentially what happened was Ebola broke out in spring of 2014. Originally, for the first 5-6 months, you know, a lot of resources were thrown at it with a very narrow medical perspective. Medical science was trying to, you know, use to try and fight Ebola, along with some computer science too. And it didn't work. And all these, you know, doctors couldn't understand why the disease kept spreading and spreading and spreading. And you had fabulous groups out there, like, you know, the World Health Organization, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others. And it wasn't until the summer they realized, and by this point, by the way, the CDC was predicting that 1.2 million people could die. And they realized that, you know, the reason why it kept spreading was because the messages were not being communicated in a culturally appropriate way. There were a number of practices that were being used which simply didn't resonate locally. And the whole strategy was being designed top down, if you like, without much sensitivity or input to local cultural mores. And when they began to bring on board some of the people who understood the cultural context, it changed quite radically. And that message about the need to blend social and medical and computing science, you know, was so important. I mean, in the end, with Ebola, they reckon between 14 and 30,000 people died, which is a tragedy and far too many, but it wasn't 1.2. And once they changed their strategy, they did get it under control. That lesson could and should have been learned with COVID.
But Jillian, just on that point, I mean, the treatment of dead bodies and the ways in which you say, oh, we Westerners rejected these things as primitive and as really backwards, and would never consider such interventions. And you seem to say we got it wrong. And in fact, we do some of the same things.
Well, one of the things that emerged with Ebola, which was causing the disease to keep spreading, was funeral practices locally, which had been very much based traditionally about the idea of touching dead bodies. And it was a mark of respect in the Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberian, cultures, that actually if someone died and you were grieving and there was trauma, you wanted to go and touch the person and actually show your respect. It was very, very important within the belief system. And most of the Western medical officials who arrived just said, that is disgusting, it's primitive and barbaric, and this undertone of these are really weird people, and we're going to ban it. And so they literally banned it, and they refused to let anyone bury, hold traditional burial rituals. They took patients away from the villages to treat them. They made it very clear that they were very scornful of most of the local traditions and belief systems. And as a result, you had a mass rebellion, an outbreak of, resistance, frankly. And that made the problem 10 times worse. And there was very little attempt to communicate in ways that would be sensitive locally, or even work with the local culture, not against it. And it wasn't until they began to devise alternative rituals that could actually still respect people, that didn't involve touching bodies. And it wasn't until they did simple things like creating fences around the exclusion centers where they were treating patients, which actually had see-through bits to them, so the families could see what was happening to their loved ones. When they began to do things like that, which are not rocket science, but just required a bit of listening, then the path of Ebola changed. So if you fast forward to COVID-19, one of the great lessons is that having a government just issuing top-down edicts in an insensitive way without trying to co-opt local communities, having an inability to learn from what's happened in other experiences, other parts of the world, these are big, big handicaps. And if only the Trump administration had paid more attention to the Ebola story, it could have helped them formulate policy much more effectively. Or even, to cite another example, the story of masks in Asia, because there's a lot of anthropologists who've studied mask wearing during epidemics in Asia, who point out that the benefit of a mask is not just the physical fabric that stops germs from a medical perspective, but the psychological prompt of putting on a mask each day reminds you to change your behavior. And the signaling device of showing that I actually have respect for community norms, that's really important too. And again, that was a lesson that could and should have been learned a lot earlier.
But people, if your culture and your norms are individual rights, what in fairness to the Trump administration, or what could we have learned? I mean, the cultural practice in this country is seemingly more focused on the right of the individual to choose whether they wish to mask or not, or any other. And so how does one actually square what you're saying, from the Ebola experience to a cultural practice, the resistance to a top-down edict from the Biden administration that we have seen in particular geographies and cultures? And to your point, in the African-American community where there was vaccine hesitancy, you're right. I think public health officials did know that they had to have trusted African-American leaders and community speaking to other African Americans to be authentically validated. What are we to make of this in a culture like the United States today?
Well, going back to what happened in 2020 in America, one of the first mistakes was to label it as a Chinese invasion, a Chinese threat. Because if you look back at the history of epidemics and pandemics, there tends to always be a very strong xenophobic reaction.
Yes, you're right.
To kind of like shut the doors. And there's a wonderful anthropologist called Mary Douglas who's done a lot of work on the idea of pollution and purity and how it distorts people's assessment of risk and relative risks. And the temptation is always to assume that risks come from outside. They don't come from inside our community. It's like those horrible, dirty people outside. And so the epitome of that was labeling, COVID as the Chinese flu, the Chinese invasion. It's like those dirty people outside. and not paying enough attention to your own domestic risk and how there could be pollution inside your own domestic space. There was an outbreak inside the White House because, as they said, Chinese invasion, they weren't actually looking inside themselves and recognizing that there's, frankly, there can be pollution everywhere. And that was played out many times, this, people being so lax about their domestic situation. Having a consistent messaging on masks is really powerful. And it's very striking that, I would give the New York authorities a lot of credit for how they messaged on the mask issue in Manhattan, where I live. And of course, being locked down, everyone only knew what was happening in their own little patch. But I did go to London during 2020 and was stunned by the contrast between London and Manhattan. Because in Manhattan, you had these very consistent messages right from early on saying, we are New York proud, wear a mask, forget about it, no mask, forget about it. And masks were presented through the messaging to the Manhattanites as kind of a source of pride, not pride, of patriotism, of respect, of strength. It's like, because historically masks on the streets of Manhattan had been this kind of sign of stigma, and it was associated with, Asian strange difference. And suddenly they were being redefined as a New York thing, forget about it, with all these New York slogans. And it was very consistent. And frankly, it was very, very, very effective. I mean, the mask wearing in New York was incredibly high, even though there were very few actual mandates that forced you to wear a mask as such. I mean, you weren't getting fined for not wearing a mask. Compare that to London, which I also saw, where you had Boris Johnson, who, a bit like Trump, initially refused to wear a mask. First of all, he said masks are stupid. And then he kind of didn't, then he sort of refused to wear one. And they told everyone else to wear a mask, but he didn't wear one. And he used to rip it off. And the whole thing was not seen as a source of strength or community responsibility. It was seen as a kind of weird thing that those scientists, this real dismissal of elite voices were promoting. Unsurprisingly, you can tell now which policy was more effective. The tragedy in America, of course, is that masks became a signaling device, not just of respect for community in some communities, it then became politicized as well, tragically.
Indeed, indeed.
And again, another simple example is that pandemics are not just about medical science, cultural science too.
Yeah, and what's been the response from the technology community? All these technologists that you are in some way indicting, you are challenging the sort of hegemonic thinking that comes out of Silicon Valley in this regard.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of technologists, a lot of big tech companies in the last 2 decades have actually started hiring anthropologists to a large degree. There's a group called EPIC, Ethnographic Praxis in Context, weird name, which is basically about applied anthropology. And, they were created a couple of decades ago. The first few years, their meetings were quite sparsely attended. And then about 4 years ago, they became total sellouts. And the reason was that a lot of the anthropology ideas had been picked up by the tech sector and brought into what they call USX, user experience research, big time, to study how their consumers were behaving. And they did that partly because they had realized that although originally you had all these Silicon Valley bros creating clever tech for other Silicon Valley bros or middle-class Americans, as they got bigger, they started to sell all over the world. And they had to understand other cultures who were not Silicon Valley bros. So big input of a big sort of hoovering up of ethnographic anthropology skills. But that was overwhelmingly initially to study the consumers and to design products better. Then more recently, there became an attempt to try and look at some of the issues raised by the explosion of social media that we're now becoming familiar with, misinformation, manipulation, addiction, all those kind of things online. So again, anthropologists have brought in a bit for that. What has not happened yet, and is really the missing link, is tech companies using anthropologists to study themselves, to look in the mirror, to think about how their own tunnel vision and biases are not just creating products that might be dangerous for other people or less than beneficial, but also how, frankly, their own biases and tunnel visions are creating this kind of mood of techlash, which can end up hurting themselves. I mean, it's so similar to what happened in the financial sector, where you have a powerful elite of technocrats who are in command of a kind of knowledge and language that no one else understands, but which has the ability to affect us all, but who also have, as a group, a really strong creation mythology that they have convinced themselves that they believe. I mean, that happened in finance with
Yeah,
innovation.
you're right about this. Yeah, why don't you talk about that, because you're right about a good segue to your what you write about the 2008-2009 financial crisis.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think they're very similar. I mean, people after the financial crisis, when I was writing about that as a journalist, um, a lot of other journalists said, well, the crisis happened because those bankers were evil or greedy or mad or stupid or awful. And I sort of look at them and think, well, the bankers I know, because I've been covering finance since 2005, they're not mad. They are not, stupid, far from it. They're not evil for the most part. It might be a bit greedy, but what they really were was a group of people who were caught up in a culture which was creating very dysfunctional impacts and making bright people stupid. And by that, I mean that essentially one of the big problems with the financial industry was that you had these groups, these tribes of technocrats, of geeks, of financial, wizards who were operating in tiny little networks with very little outside scrutiny. And the networks were bound together by the fact they all spoke the same language. They all engaged in the same rituals and ceremonies and stuff like that, called investment banking conferences, where they come together and basically reinforce their shared worldview. They were all part of the same cyber network, which I used to call the Bloomberg Village. They all had the same Bloomberg sign-on with their emails. And there was nothing malicious about this, but they all had a very strong sense of being almost set apart because they had control of this knowledge. And because there was little outside scrutiny, they had a very strong creation myth, which basically said that all this financial innovation was going to make the world better. And I think they really believed it.
Isn't that true though? Often, I mean, again,
Yeah.
that's a consistent. These guys, and they are mostly guys. These guys truly believe, and most of them do. I authentically believe that they are solving the world's problems, which, by the way, will make them all billionaires.
Absolutely. And one of the things that gets forgotten about the run up to 2008 was that when I started covering the sector of what they call securitization, financial engineering in 2005, there was this cult of liquefaction, this idea that all this innovation was going to create the perfect free market where every risk could be traded and everything could be priced correctly. And the theory was riddled with intellectual contradictions and cognitive dissonance, which I won't go into, but basically in retrospect it seemed crazy, but at the time they couldn't see it because they were so busy and there was so little outside scrutiny, there was very little challenge. But also there's that great Upton Sinclair quote that it's very hard to get a man to believe if his job or salary depends on not believing. We all have a vested interest in having this cognitive dissonance, including, I should say, journalists. We're all faced with this. And that goes back to the power of anthropology, because it's only by periodically jumping out of your water as a fish, out of your cultural assumptions and your world, and tasting something else briefly and then coming back, that you can start to see yourself clearly and start to see the social silences that you're ignoring. And similarly, if you rely on having a top-down bird's eye view of life all the time, which is what most disciplines like finance and economics do, and technology, and don't have a bottom-up worm's eye view of what's happening on the ground, which is what anthropology does, it's very hard to see what's really going on. And last story, Darren, is that, you might have seen that. Have you seen that wonderful movie, The Big Short?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, based on the book by Michael Lewis.
Right.
Well, there's a scene in that where the hedge fund traders, David Einhorn and people, go down and meet a pole dancer in Florida. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And she says that she's taken out a bunch of subprime mortgages and they're shocked. And the thing that's shocking is not the fact that they found a pole dancer who'd done that. It was the fact that almost none of the other financiers at the time were actually doing that. They were all basically living in their own little worlds
Right.
and not tasting real life. And they had the bird's eye view, not the worm's eye view.
And the products they were actually selling to people who weren't always credit worthy, uh, like this woman. Um, so when you fast forward here, as a journalist, you just mentioned that you journalists are guilty of Upton Sinclair's admonition, um, that you have all the incentives to not believe. That could be said about a lot of people in society. What, how do you think that manifests? What does that look like?
Well, it manifests itself in several ways as a journalist because journalism has its own culture. And, one of the things that if you are trained as a journalist, you start to do is have a very clear-cut definition of what a story is. And a story tends to be something which is dramatic, step change event. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. It's got a quote. It's got a person. It's got, numbers. That's a story. And that applies to some parts of the world that are important, but actually it doesn't apply to other parts. So, dramatic stories, bad news stories get a lot of coverage. Slow moving elliptical trend stories often get ignored. So to go back to what I was doing in the early part of the noughties before the 2008 crisis, all of the media attention at the time was on the equity market, which was dramatic, which created stories in the sense of people doing stuff visibly. And the slow moving story, the slow burn story around what was happening in debt and derivatives was ignored because it didn't fit the easy model of a story. Plus, there was a lot of jargon and acronyms, which are the kiss of death of any story, as defined by a journalist. I often joke, if you want to hide something in the modern world, you don't have to be a James Bond villain with a plot. Just cover it with acronyms, and it will disappear anyway. So that's one issue with journalism. Another issue is that, journalism has its own tribes. We tend to naturally gravitate to people like ourselves. And we tend, because we're trained to work with words, to assume that power and prestige goes with command of language. And if you don't have command of language, then somehow you don't have power and prestige. In some ways, being educated is one of the few acceptable forms of snobbery in America. Or it was until Donald Trump. And, I think one of the reasons why journalists were slow to realize how seriously Donald Trump was appealing to a large part of the American voting base was partly because journalists, for the most part, didn't come from the communities who felt angry and felt inclined to vote for Donald Trump's message of, disruption, etc. But also because I don't know if you remember that moment in the campaign in 2016 where Donald Trump used the word bigly. And I remember it well. I mean, he later said he said big league, but anyway, it came across in the debate as bigly. And I was on the news desk that night, and the minute he said bigly, I laughed, and everyone laughed. It was kind of almost instinctive. And it was like, gosh, someone's not using the word properly. It's not proper English. And the reality was that actually reflected more of the journalist prejudice than it reflected, the way that most voters saw that. And I think that made journalists pretty blind. And, we need to recognize there's a big epistemological split in America today. And, there are many different ways of looking at information and parsing politicians and parsing what politicians say.
Indeed. So we're going to open it up because I know there are questions. My colleague Elizabeth is the moderator for today's Ideas at Ford. But before, as Elizabeth is getting ready for that, Dr. Gillian Tett, what comes next after this book? You have a full agenda, I understand.
Well, the only place I've ever had someone use my doctor, or where I've used my doctor as a deliberate strategy, was in Japan, because I went there as a journalist back in 1997, and I was, young, female, blonde, and I was told by Japanese friends that they would never take me seriously in a senior leadership role unless I called myself Dr. Tet, because then it made it seem like I was gender neutral for Japanese culture. So I did, and it worked. So what comes next? Well, my current day job is that I chair our editorial board, which is kind of the brains trust of the FT for America. And I also write columns, and I created a platform called Moral Money a few years ago to look at environmental social governance issues. So I have a pretty full slate right now. That's why I've been at COP26, and we are really committed to trying to expand our environmental and sustainability coverage. Our readers at the FT are really obsessed by these issues right now. So I'm doing that. At some point, I would love to do more anthropology. But, I also want to try and write another book at some point. So I will see how those all fit together.
Great. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Dr. Tet. We do have a bunch of questions today. I'd love to start with a question first to follow up on the misinformation discussion, which is our current crisis of misinformation influences policies, behaviors, health, the economy. There's almost nothing it doesn't touch. So is there a way to understand and combat misinformation across fields from an anthropological basis?
Well, I think the first thing to understand about combating misinformation is to try and do the one-on-one anthropology and try and think yourself into the mind of the person who you view as basically being in the grip of misinformation. And there was a very interesting study done by a group called Jigsaw, which is part of Google, who essentially had been grappling with conspiracy theories in recent years. And, it's an area where, again, it shows the benefit of blending social and computing science, because the people who were trying to beat the conspiracy theories found it very hard to track, how and why they kept spreading. So they sent some anthropologists and ethnographers out for a best part of a year and a half to actually go and do something that the techies had never even occurred to them to do, which was actually meet the conspiracy theories face to face. They went around the UK, they went around the US and talked to them. And they realized in the course of actually listening to the conspiracy theories and meeting them with, a sense of respect, that many of their preconceptions were completely wrong. So, for example, they were thinking that, you could grade the conspiracy theory by topic according to how dangerous it was or was not. And you could ignore the safe ones and just focus on the dangerous ones. And they realized that actually what they needed to be doing was grading the person by the commitment to conspiracy theories, not by topic. Because if you were deeply in the grip of down the rabbit hole, you were as likely to be absorbed by a safe conspiracy theory as a dangerous one. And that was what really mattered. And they understood things like, if you want to deal with conspiracy theories or deal with misinformation, techies assume that you should create really slick looking professional websites because that would look more credible. Whereas conspiracy theorists tend to assume that actually only the elite will create slick websites. And so the only sites can be trusted are the ones that look homegrown and scruffy. So thinking yourself into the mindset of people is really important. Finding checks and balances, finding ways to kind of create alternative perspectives. And that can require quite a lot of tweaks to technology. I mean, most technology tools today are designed to take us down customized rabbit holes. So if you start off, reading about X, you'll find X plus, X plus, X plus, X, 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 and go further down X. We could be tweaking our technology tools to give us, different types of informational sources to actually butt in to what we're doing to create a sense of serendipity. You can be using AI to combat it in terms of flagging up dangerous content or wrong content. In many ways, that's going to be one of the more effective ways for tech companies to act, at least in the short to medium term. But the bigger question, longer term, is how do you break down the sense of tribalism inside society and create more sense of trust? And that's going to be a much bigger issue, which is going to dog us for years. Because as I keep saying, the fact we're rushing online is increasing our tribalism, not decreasing it, particularly because it's going on hand in hand with a shift in what we trust from vertical hierarchies, institutions, authority figures, to trusting our peer group online. And if your peer group is fragmented into tribes, it means that people are getting their main source of information from people just like them in their groups. And that's potentially dangerous, as we know.
Thank you, Gillian. That's wonderful, and actually leads us sort of to the next question, which is in all of these things can be helpful. Tech, looking at through different lenses, having the right people step up to bring attention to this, but who is actually responsible for ensuring that an anthrovision happens in these systems? And are we relying on leadership to care about this? And how do we hold them responsible and accountable?
Well, if you're asking how do we get corporate leaders and tech leaders and financial leaders to get out of tunnel vision and embrace lateral vision, the answer is that in some sectors, this is already happening, because one way to make sense of the rise of the ESG movement, environmental, social, and governance, is precisely that it reflects the fact that many leaders instinctively feel, although they might not articulate it this way, that they need to widen their lens and they need to pay attention to things they never used to pay attention to, like social stresses, like racial issues, like the environment. So that is happening to a degree. And what I find fascinating about ESG is that it's really happening sometimes because corporate leaders feel they actively want to change the world, and God bless them. There are many people in leadership positions who do feel they actively want to change the world and trying to do that. And that's how the ESG movement started. But today, I think that most corporate leaders and financial leaders are acting as much out of self-defense and risk management as anything else. And they're essentially embracing ESG ideas because they realize that if they don't, they will have reputational risk, portfolio risk, regulatory risk. They could lose their customers, their employees, their investors. So that fear of loss, of risk, is something that's actually forcing some sense of anthrovision. Even in the tech sector, the fact you even have people like Mark Zuckerberg talking and others talking about widening the lens and trying to a degree, embed a sense of social context in what they're doing, indicates that they realize they need to do this to a degree. I would argue it's just not happening fast enough.
Lovely. I'm going to jump to the next question, which is about, I guess, a darker side of using an anthropological lens, which is you write in your book about ways in which corporations have used an anthropological lens to understand internal culture, so it can be used to drive business success, so that it can be used to get rid of time-wasting sort of rituals. Where does that become a problem, where it becomes a manipulation of human behavior that results in an economic benefit for just the company at the expense of the people that should be protecting? Can this be avoided?
This is a really good question, and it's probably one of the most controversial issues around the whole field of business anthropology, particularly because we cannot lose sight of the fact that anthropology started off as a pretty dirty discipline, in that it was being used by colonial administrators to try and study, what they would call the natives, to work out how to control them, convert them, tax them, trade with them, whatever. And that sense of people in power using cultural knowledge to try and control less powerful people has haunted the discipline ever since then. In today's context, there absolutely are some anthropologists who would argue that it's simply not ethical to work for a company and use cultural analysis to sell more goods, or to use cultural analysis to try and help the management understand workers better. And I respect people who say that that is just dirty, you shouldn't be part of it. I respect that there are academics who say, I don't want to go anywhere near any of this practical usage at all. Of course, tied up with that is, a whole seam of people who say that actually the military, American military, has used anthropologists in the past in places like Vietnam, Korea, more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, again, for reasons that people regard as very dirty. So I respect that. However, I'd also say that, where I come from, I think that we could and should be trying to fight to get the C-suite to have a wider sense of culture and context and more lateral vision. I actually think it's actually better if, say, tech devices are not created just for and by Silicon Valley bros, but actually are mindful of the whole spectrum of experience and interest of consumers. I think it's beneficial if you can actually try and use anthropologists to look at the culture of companies and get a more nuanced and frankly sensitive and empathetic perspective on the part of corporate leaders. So for all those reasons, I think there actually is a place for anthropology in companies. And just to give you, another example, one of the stories I tell in my book is about General Motors, which in the 1990s had a merger, which was going very bad, or not merger, an attempted combined project between German car makers and car makers from Detroit and Tennessee. And they were supposed to be working together to build a joint car. It was going very badly wrong. Everyone was blaming it on ethnic differences. And in fact, some anthropologists came in and said, no, it's not because they're German and American. It's because the different teams of engineers have fundamentally different ideas about what the point of a meeting is and how you communicate. And there were many differences between the team in Detroit and Tennessee as between Detroit and the German team. And, sadly, by the time they found those points out, it was too late to do anything about it. But that idea of trying to teach corporations to be more empathetic to cultural difference and to recognize that not everyone thinks the same way as the top management, I think is a very, very powerful goal.
Great.
Thank you so much. The next question, thank you for giving the example. So the next question is also asking for examples, which is, do you have any institution, large institution or group that you believe has successfully integrated anthropology intelligence into their operations in a way that has had a positive impact or made a positive change?
There are some which have tried to incorporate it in periods for particular projects. So there were times when Intel used anthropologists to try and develop some of their ideas and products in a way that was, interesting. Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, at times has incorporated it. There are efforts underway. I talked earlier about some of the medical experiences. Paul Farmer is somebody who has very deliberately tried to bring on board cultural sensitivity and analysis into the way he's developed his medical strategies. Very admirable. So there are lots of micro examples, but in terms of macro examples, no. And I think that's one of the big missing gaps right now. And as we try and build back better after the pandemic, I think it's something that should be on the table and we should be talking about, a lot more.
I think we are talking about it. We just don't name it. And I think we're not doing it with the sort of intensity and the urgency and scale that we need to.
Yeah, no, I agree. And far too often we are basically, bringing in one tiny team of experts from one discipline to try and solve a problem, rather than saying, okay, let's try and blend the computer and the social science.
Right. And in one unit of a 10,000 employee company, that's not going to change the behavior of the company. Elizabeth, our last question.
Wonderful. So our last question is, nonprofits don't always get it right, which you see especially in global projects or through NGOs. So how can we, as foundations, as not-for-profits, how can we better apply anthropology to proactive social change strategy?
Well, I think there's like 2 or 3 ways that you can do that. One lesson from anthropology is this point about jumping out of your fishbowl. And, anyone who's working in the nonprofit sector, is probably surrounded most of the time with people just like them in a very admirable way. But, it's so easy to fall into this kind of, tribal mentality and pattern. So jumping out of the fishbowl from time to time, I think is very useful. I think trying to listen with empathy to the people who you're trying to work for and put yourself into their mindset again. Many nonprofits do try and do this, but this old adage about trying to walk in people's shoes to understand how things look from other people's perspective is so important. But perhaps the other way that nonprofits can really do this is to try and act as a bridge or a tunnel or a translation framework for your funders. And one of the things that I think is can be very powerful is trying to teach empathy up and down, and teach the people who are funding you not just to provide the money, not just to kind of tick the boxes and think, oh yeah, I did X, Y, and Z, but actually to have a sense of empathy and awareness of how life looks from the perspective of the people you're trying to help. And whether that's in relation to homeless projects, educational projects, poverty alleviation projects, whether it's to do with environmental costs and things like that. I mean, one of the biggest terrible tragedies and ironies of our age is that we live in a world where the internet could potentially connect us all and give us a shared empathy and understanding. We have at the tip of our fingers the ability to actually see through a computer screen, what it's like to be, Inuit coping with climate change and what it means in terms of loss of livelihood, or somebody who's living with, in Bangladesh from climate change, or somebody who's living in impoverished, communities, across America, or whatever you want to choose in terms of whatever problem you're trying to solve from a nonprofit perspective. We can actually, all of us actually peer into other corners of our lives. And if we choose, we can go and actually soak ourselves in the conversations and mindsets that other people are having, if we can find that online. The problem today, though, is that even as the internet is opening up the world to us, potentially, if we choose, we ourselves are defining ourselves into tighter and tighter little tribal groups, because we've been locked down for the last year in our tribal group in a situation of fear, which has fueled so much xenophobia. We go online and we replicate our tribalism online. And we have this kind of customized experience, which makes this tribal experience even worse. And so I guess what nonprofits can be doing is trying to do practical help, channel aid to where it's needed, try and change the world for better, but also try and channel information and awareness and empathy. And that really is 101 anthropology.
Thank you, Dr. Gillian Tett. And I want to, as we close, congratulate you on your upcoming award from the American Anthropological Association. You are receiving their President's Medal, a huge honor, I believe, especially for a lapsed anthropologist.
Yeah, well, many anthropologists, and I fully, deeply respect them for this. Academic anthropologists are often, have historically often been quite suspicious of people who are no longer in academia. Anthropology itself suffers from a lot of tribalism and can often be quite myopic. That's one of my frustrations. The people who go into anthropology as a career are often trained to observe, not speak, and they're quite cynical about power structures and money structures. So they're often quite anti-establishment. So people like me who jump into the limelight and talk a lot and, are so obviously invisibly dancing with the establishment at times, invoke a lot of suspicion. So I wasn't expecting to be honored by the anthropologist, but, it's a very nice surprise.
And well-deserved, Gillian. Proud of you. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
So that concludes this session of Ideas at Ford. I'm looking forward to the weeks ahead, when we have, I think, some really, really terrific interviews and conversations with people I know and admire. On December 8th, Rob Reich and Maran Tahami, their book System Era is absolutely, following this conversation about technology, certainly salient. And then on December 13th, my dear friend Indra Nooyi and her best-selling book, My Life in Full. I'll look forward to seeing you on both occasions. Thank you. Have a great day.